first of all, as we all know, there are diseases all over the world which cause horrible problems with poverty and just misery, quality of life. I mean, we Americans, with all of our troubles and disputes over mortgages going bad, whatever, still elsewhere in the world, it's very bad. I mean, we have a pretty good compared to many. And if I could be so bold, a lot of the difficulties that we see in terms of wars, terrorism, weird beliefs, whatever you want to call it, a lot of times stems from these horrible situations. And when people have hope, when they can get out of these horrible situations, then they no longer really find these fanatical, crazy ideas that are practice. And one of the key vectors in that context is the abatement of these various diseases, many of which are extremely difficult to deal with by traditional pharmaceuticals because it's too expensive and too complex to work with programs. On the other hand, if these things could be eradicated by genetic disease, that's a positive thing. The cost to our economy here, because of people getting things like Alzheimer's or dementia, other things like that, where people simply lose their mental faculties before their physical capacities are picked up. Again, these are things that could be dealt with genetically. So, I mean, there is a positive side to that. The flip side says, is there a ruling body or is there a consortium where public opinion can insert itself so that there's some kind of a guidepost or some kind of a framework that people can relate to? The challenge here is that these are technically very complex topics. So trying to get the general public to connect to this level of science is very, very challenging. It's more like an education problem as opposed to a moral problem.
Yeah, it does make sense, and I think in some ways, I don't want to infer that you would belong to any one group, just straight out of the gate. But for me, one of the things that I feel like science, and maybe rightly so, is that the people in the scientific community have an extreme top-down perspective on sort of the rest of humanity, and maybe it's because of their training and background and intelligence, and it gives them kind of a real vertical perspective. But at the same time, I mean, we all came out of the chute. We're all
exactly.
Carbon and blood, and we all have the same processes. So we all have a horizontal relationship to our own matrices for now, at least.
I'm going to throw out a really strange curveball just because it's a show that allows that kind of thing, so why not? In my humble opinion, having spent many, many years with the Department of Energy and having spent many years with folks at NASA and having seen quite a pretty broad swath of things that affect the world, climate change, quality of life, the potential for life being what it could be versus what it is now, et cetera, probably the number one negative driver is overpopulation. I mean, that's not going to sit well with a lot of folks for religious reasons. I do get that. But if I could be so bold, I would offer the idea, theoretically at least, I think it would be an improvement if the population could be held at its current level or even reduced a little bit, but the quality of life would simply be increased much more. Now, is that really possible? Probably not, for obvious reasons, cultural, if nothing else. But in an ideal world, that's what you'd like to be shooting for. You'd like to be shooting for probably less dense populations, but populations where the quality of life is as good as it could possibly be. And whether or not we have the wisdom to use the current set of tools to get to that end goal, that's a very open debate and probably not possible, at least in our world. I would suggest to you that if one believes that life exists in other worlds, and I think it does, there's probably been quite a few examples of Earth-like planets that have gone through this very moment, where they got to a certain point where they saturated the Earth's population carrying capacity. They're at the very edge of sort of suppressing the life support capacity in the future in terms of consumption of non-renewable resources, and they have a very short window of time in which to make these crucial decisions. And unless the majority of the world's populations could sort of see things on the same level and then agree to kind of go forward for the better reasons, they probably perish. And that may be part of what our design strategy is. In other words, we kind of have to go through a series of these evolutionary tests. As you've heard me say before in previous talks, excuse me, I tend to view evolution as a kind of a trauma-induced process. That is, given the trauma cycles or periodicity and amplitude don't exceed the system capacity to respond, the system does sort of come back more robust. That tends to work like a fractal with all different scales. And so on a planetary scale, we as a civilization, we're at this very edge where we sort of know, we can see most of the jigsaw puzzle being assembled before us. We kind of know that if we just go the way we're going, we're probably going to do ourselves in, not with warfare, but just by simply draining their planetary resources and probably creating some really terrible situations in terms of the planet itself. So can we willingly decide to, en masse, kind of go to collective direction that says this is the better way to go? That's an open question mark, and that's probably more of a question than the actual technology itself.
Well, you've been around high technology for a number of years. I mean, you do business with people that that remain nameless for good reasons because you have contractual obligations with them, and I'm sure that you have seen or at least heard of technology that most of us are not even remotely aware of. And my question,
in some cases, true. Yes, in some cases, true. Yes.
Okay, so my question to you then, Charles, is: are we dealing with a controlled paradigm in which that technology is being held back for a specific reason? And if it is, can't that technology be used in service of kind of liberating, the 6 billion people that are on the planet now and improving the quality of life?
Yeah, well, there's some dark stuff and then there's some lighter stuff. So the dark stuff first, maybe just to kind of start off on a tangent. I mean, some people have talked about things. Well, there's something called proteomic targeting. Let me start with that. And proteomic targeting means that if, for instance, for dealing with cancer, this is the number one issue right now. And just to make it very straightforward, cancer basically is the situation where you have cells that have lost their genetic identity or affinity with these cells that they want, with the tissue that they want to eliminate from. So when you have a tumor, when you have leukemia, or one of these other kinds of cancers, the cells start to reproduce on their own, and they have a different physiology and a different proteomic signature. So the theory is, I mean, right now, for instance, if you have most of these different kinds of cancers, the best you can hope for is chemotherapy like methotrexate or one of these truly awful drugs. And the theory is to kill off a bunch of cells, and hopefully a few of the good ones still survive to kill off all the bad ones. But that's a pretty bad. That's not a very good way to go.
The odds are not stacked in your favor.
Yeah, methotrexate and those kinds of things is a pretty. I mean, the treatment is almost as bad as the disease.
Yeah.
However, by extreme contrast, if one could have a particular kind of molecule, like a dendrimer, for instance, which is this branchy looking, it looks like a little tree sort of thing, and you can decorate the outside of it with different kinds of proteomic compounds that will match a very specific genetic signature, and then when that dendrimer, for instance, communicates chemically with the cancer cell in question, it'll then open up and squirt into it a protein like P43 that'll actually turn the cell off and say, okay, stop doing your thing. That's very good because you can precisely target just the bad cells, and then everything else is left alone. So this is a very good application for proteomic targeting. However, the exact same mechanism could also be used for something really awful, like a bioweapon that would be racially selective or selective on some other genetic marker. And those things have been talked about.
Well, not just talked about. I mean, I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, Monsanto has actually created a seed.
I don't want to comment on Monsanto exactly, but I will say that I have been to a number of biodefense-related conferences, and I have seen our attempts to counteract against that kind of thing. I'll just put it that way. I mean, it's a known thing, and the people are trying to deal with how to respond to such a thing we're to be encountered. I'll go that far.
Speaking of seeds, what do you make of Bill Gates and the whole Svalbard seed vault? What's your take on that?
I think the seed vault's a great idea. I mean, look, if all heck breaks loose and we just don't make it, and it could be anything. I personally feel, by the way, people have talked a lot about nuclear weapons and that kind of thing. For example, I look at Pakistan as being a very fragile situation. If Pakistan were to suddenly go, just fall apart in civil war, and a few nukes got in the wrong hands, it could be very bad. But that would actually be fairly minimal compared to a biological, which, if it was released and spread like a pandemic, and was one of these designer bugs that nobody had a map for, the way this works is you have a catalog of known phenotypes that, if you know what the bad bug is, you can detect it pretty quickly and then develop some kind of antidote or some kind of way of responding to it. The problem is when you have these designer bugs where there is no genetic sort of code for it and you don't know what it is, first to determine, what is it exactly, and then what's the pathology associated with it, and then how do you deal with it. So if there is a designer bug that was released somewhere in some context and was some mixture of hantavirus that was airborne, aerosol dispersant, and caused death in 24 hours or something, it could be pretty bad. And if it involves some kind of proteomic targeting mechanism, so they're only going after a certain range of people with a certain genetic footprint, that kind of thing could happen. And then, of course, if that mutated, it could wipe out, a good portion of the Earth's population. In my mind, that's probably the worst of the worst. And the thing about biologicals that gets my attention is, unlike nuclear, where you can detect nuclear, you can sense it from a distance. I won't go into details, but it is possible to determine if there's something nuclear even pretty far away. Biologicals, on the other hand, can be totally sealed up, and you could be sitting in a room with a jar full of something right next to you, wouldn't even know it was there. And to kind of give you a little glimpse of that idea, I actually had a chance to spend about 4 hours with Dr. Ken Allebeck. And Ken Allebeck wrote a very famous book called Biohazard. He was the supreme director of biowarfare development for the former Soviet Union. He answered directly to Gorbachev before the Soviet Union dissolved, and now he's a consultant in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, there's a lot of people out there who sort of know this. And what's interesting about, if you read the book Biohazard or, research this, but they had metric tons of all kinds of horrible things, these solutions. They would essentially inoculate these various bad bugs in eggs. That's how it's normally done. And then they would break the eggs up and then make a sort of a slurry out of it and store it in various ways. And out in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, which is where this stuff is being done, there were, barrels and drums full of this stuff sort of laying around after the Soviet Union dissolved. Now, who knows where that stuff may have gone to? And that's the kind of thing that worries me, is that, even a small amount of that kind of stuff in the wrong hands could be very, very bad. So in a way, a lot of this pandemic research and a lot of the sort of biodefense work is, I think, extremely important, because if something like that is released, we have to have some way of dealing with it. We have to have some way of theoretically testing for variations of those types of pathogens as released.
Well, fair enough. I'd agree with that. I mean, at least for the Cold War, theoretically, right? I mean, you were dealing with game theory, and you were dealing with weapons of mass destruction.
And you're also dealing with people who were logical. In other words, look, let me give you an example. This might be sort of interesting. When I was at Los Alamos for a couple of years, back when Reagan took over from Carter, and I was working on a big laser, now declassified, called Antares. It was a big, giant, kind of like a Star Wars laser. In fact, it was part of the Star Wars program. And our mission was to be able to target and neutralize incoming multiple reentry vehicle warheads, or MIRVs as they're called. Now, back when I was at Los Alamos, I remember very clearly one day sitting with a couple of my comrades there, and I was saying, we've got some of the best technology on the planet, some of the most interesting people you could possibly find. We're spending all this money on these giant lasers and the other things that we're developing. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could not do this, but do something more useful instead? And, it's kind of just a wild thought on my part. Well, 25 years later, literally 25 years later, I was giving a talk in Virginia to this sort of Nano Tech and energy conference, and I was approached from a fellow in the audience who came up to after I gave my talk, and he said, well, look, I'm working with something called the IPP, or Initiative for Proliferation Prevention. And I said, what's that? And he explains, and what it was, or what it still is, this was a program, after the Soviet Union dissolved, they had literally thousands of PhD scientists who were looking for work. I mean, they closed down a lot of their black laboratories, and they were trying to convert to peaceful technology. So they wanted to bring over these Soviet scientists, and hook up with venture investors here so they could develop, peaceful things. So I went to this conference a year later in Philadelphia. Here I'm this big trade show with 10,000 people and all kinds of displays and things. And I'm working with a group called Fourth Venture, who specialize in that kind of east-west technology convergence stuff. So I was on the floor, and I met these three guys. They developed this very beautiful wind turbine, which, by the way, is right here in California now. It turns out these were the head designers of the very missiles, the very warheads, from the Makiyev State Rocket Facility in the center of Russia at that time. The very guys whose machine we were trying to shoot down, I met them in person and shook their hand. And we, through a translator, we were talking back and forth. And it was like the most bizarre, unexpected sort of dream suddenly coming true. So, I mean, even though it sounds kind of Pollyannish, these things do happen. We kind of got past that point. But the point I was hoping to make was what I found out when I was talking with these Soviet scientists and a lot of their other people with them. These folks are just like us. They have families. They care about life. They care about the planet. They're not crazy folks. They were just doing as they were told, and they were given a certain kind of agenda to fulfill, and they were doing their thing. What we have in the current world is something very different. We have small groups, not associated with the nation state, who are driven by fanatical ideology as opposed to a traditional sort of religious paradigm or a political paradigm. So that's a much more difficult target to kind of deal with. It's called asymmetrical warfare. And that's the thing that's scary, because there is no centralized, there's no ruler, there's no polithero, there's no traditional, pathway of treaty. You're dealing more like warlords and bands of fanatics driven by religious ideology. It's a very different kind of situation, and that's why we have to take a different kind of response to it.
So in the quote unquote conspiratorial world, or the exopolitical world, right?